Today I'm going to be winterising my trusted little Honda 2.3 outboard, and job number one is to empty the fuel. When you undo the cap, it's best just to take it off completely. It's just held by this little plastic catch there. That's it, we're ready to go. Job number one, get the cover off. It's held by this little rubber clip there. Lift that up. You can't remove it completely because of the starter cord in the way, so we just have to sort of latch it out of the way where it's not going to be a nuisance. And the carburetor's in here, and that's what we're going to look at today. It's not as strictly essential to take it to bits, but I like to make sure all the old fuel has been cleaned out and it's really set and ready for winter. You need very few tools: a small socket with an 8 and a 10mm. I think I have the right one set in there. Job number one, undo this cap here. Two little bolts for that. That comes off. You need to be careful. There's a little rubber slider here which goes on the, don't break that as you pull it off. Right, that's the carburetor. This is the air cleaner intake there. So next job is to, this cover is held on by these two bolts there, so we'll get undoing them. When you take these out, notice one is shorter than the other. This one is the shorter one. Right, we've undone that cover. You need to, I'm not going to hopefully have to change the gasket, so I'm just carefully going to remove that, keep it safe. And cover as well, put it on there. Now we have to undo this cable bolt here that holds the throttle cable. Same size spanner, it's all very handy. The carburetor is loose now because the bolts that held the air cover also hold the carburetor. Now we can undo that. And the next easiest thing to do is to lift the carburetor up a bit and pull the fuel pipe off the carburetor there. Then you can tilt the carburetor to undo these two cables, and hey presto, that's the carburetor off. Not a difficult job. The next thing I want to do is to drain any fuel that's left in the pipes and to give the pipework a flush out, and I'm going to use methylated spirit. So I'm going to put the pipe in there, pour some in there, and it's come trickling out. That will flush out all the old signs of petrol and stop any residue building up in a tank. You might need to just give it a little bit of assistance, a blow on there. Health and safety would probably disapprove that, but It's only methylated spirits. That's that empty. Now I'm just going to give the carburetor a little wash through with meths again, and you can pour this quite liberally over the unit. While we're at this stage of dismantling, I might as well illustrate how to clean the main carburetor jet, because if anything's going to stop the engine working, it is most likely to be a block jet. So this is the float chamber. You need a 10mm socket, and comes undone fairly easily. This is the float. It's held in place by this little pin, so take that out and then carefully lift off the float. You have to be very careful with this little valve. You don't want to lose or displace that. And the main jet we're interested in is in here. You need quite a thin screwdriver. Pop it in there and unscrew. When it's loose, it will come out. I'll show you how these go back in a minute. Right, the most likely problem you're going to get is this jet will be blocked. It's a tiny little hole. If you fancy it, you can blow through it. This one's clear. If necessary,
Fishing lines.
Clean it with a bristle or a tiny bit of nothing metallic. It must be nylon or bristle, nothing that could potentially damage the jet. Same again with this one, needs to be clear. Absolutely fine. So now we pop it all back together. This goes in with the fatter end at the bottom, and then the jet goes in with a screw bit at the end, and gently do it up. Reasonable tightness, doesn't need to be mega tight. Pop the float back in, taking care to see the jet goes into its little hole there, and then gently slide the pin back in to locate the float. That's held in place by the cover, so it can't come undone once the cover's on. Pop that in place there. Make sure the rubber gasket is in position. Rubber seal really, not a gasket. And from memory, that goes a little bit, like about 5 degrees around from the overflow pipe. But you can adjust it once the carburetor is back on the engine. Put that back in. And tighten up. Again, doesn't need to be super tight, the gasket will stop any fuel leaking out. And there she is, all clean and ready to go back on. We need to make sure that the gasket is okay. This is quite an important one, much more important than the one that comes out here, and that looks pretty alright. So, number one job, put the cable clips in. Just getting the right way around. They're can be a little bit fiddly. And then pop the fuel pipe on, making sure the clip goes over the slightly wider part of the pipe, and then feed the carburetor down into position. Now you get it roughly in position, and and then we get the filter cover. There's a hole here which has to line up with this rubber pipe here, so that's the first thing you need to do, is to just make sure that's getting lined up properly before you go any further. It sometimes helps to move the fuel lever a little bit to get it out of the way. There we go. Put that back now. Right, so as I pointed out before, the short bolt goes on this side. It goes through the carburetor and onto this engine plate, and on it goes. Back to the smaller socket. Then the other one. You have to jiggle the carburetor around a little bit to get it lined up properly. So okay, now the next thing is to refit the throttle cable clamp. I should really have put that loosely in place before I put the cover on, because now it's a little bit fiddly to get at. Now the next bit's quite crucial. The throttle needs to be absolutely closed. You need to hold that. So holding that tight in, we then clamp the cable up. If you don't do that, then the engine will start revving too highly when you start it up. Double check that. No, it's not gone back fully. You have to get this right, otherwise the engine is not going to run well. Perfect, it's going right back to its seating. So just double check the tightness of that. That's tight. Those two bolts are tight. And now we can put the cover back on, making sure again to slide the rubber bush on there first, locate it over the holes, and pop those two screws back in. Doesn't need to be crazily tight, just clamped up. So that's the carburetor back in place. My drain on the float chamber is a little bit out of position. If I wanted to, I could just pop a socket up through there, loosen off the chamber and swing it around a bit, but I don't use it, so, and it's, in any case, it's all rusted up, so it's no good. Just make sure the overflow pipe is pointing towards this hole here. While we've got all in bits, we might as well just have a look at the sparking plug and take off the lead, undo the plug. My engine doesn't get many hours use a year, so the plug is pretty clean. In fact, it's really clean, and with modern fuels they don't tend to foul up like they used to. The gap is about right. I haven't got feeler gauges to hand, but in an ideal world you would just check that with a feeler gauge. So all's well there. Put that back in. If it was messed up, it's probably best just to buy a new one rather than try and clean it. Cleaning sparking plugs is not the best of ways to deal with them. Tighten that up, pop the lead back on. Now, what I reckon, oh sorry, we'll put the fuel cap back on. What I reckon is the most important part of the winterisation is to spray it with duck oil. This is brilliant stuff. You can see from previous applications I'm left with a slightly smeary film on there, and that's what duck oil does. It covers everything. Like if somebody had used it from new, we wouldn't have those rusty bits there because it protects everything. I use it on my boat diesel engines and I spray them about once a fortnight, and there's not a sign of rust anywhere on either engine, despite the amount of water that sloshes around the engine room. This stuff can be sprayed on anything, on rubber belts, electrics. It has no detrimental effects at all. It does tend to leave a bit of an oily residue, and you'll find that if you use it on a boat engine room as well. You'll think you've got an oil leak on the engine, but in fact it's just residue collecting at the bottom of the engine room. So nice spray. This is not cheap stuff. I think a 5 litre can is well over £20, but I got a free spray with mine, so especially good value. And I'm literally just going to cover everything. Including the gear bits down here. So one more thing just before we pop it away is to check the oil level, which I didn't mention before. It needs to be about halfway up the sight glass. Mine's fine. If you do need to top it up, you undo the filler plug there, and then you need a pretty fine tube or a funnel to be able to pour the oil into there. But, as I say, this one is fine, so we can pop the cover back on. You have to make sure you get the tab into the slot in here first. Make sure it's over the top, and then ease these lugs into position and pop the cover in all round and clip it on. Hey presto, one engine winterized and ready to put away in the shed.